Want to start today. I've been reading the newspapers for the last 4 days, and I want to just begin by saying that as we continue our meditation on the metaphor of the desert, I'd like to review where this metaphor has taken us the last 3 weeks. We have reflected so far on the more non-physical aspects of the meaning of desert, the place where we are alone to engage God without props or unnecessary toys, as it were. The place where we had to meet ourselves as ourselves and meet God alone. It is the place where we are pushed to take risks that in the long run will make our lives more full, more meaningful. At least that is the hope. Then has come upon us the coronavirus, which is shut down, and the image of the desert has changed from being strictly metaphorical to actually physical. We are now in the midst of a physical dryness that impacts our lives in new ways. We have social distancing. Our social haunts have been closed. Our public life has been reduced to engagement in only essential services. And even that is being defined for us. We are adjusting to a new pattern of living. We are being pushed to change our lives in new ways. Some are doing this reasonably well, some are still resisting. I mused when I read a newspaper article this week about young people who are at beach parties because this is spring break, speaking defiantly about not letting authority figures and people outside themselves alter their lifestyle. This new knowledge we have about safe living and protecting oneself and others is resoundingly rejected still by large numbers of people. Some people are still not listening because to listen means to change, to alter your life, to maybe by adhering to safe policies, acceptance that is a common its effort and it's not just about me. This physical desert we're living in is pushing other issues before us about the meaning of life, of our place in the world, of asking where God is in all of this. Is God walking alongside us as we go through all the changes being demanded on us within the last few weeks? What does God want from us? What is God doing to us? What does God want us to see in this desert? And I am reminded that one of the ways in which we are beginning to respond, and maybe this is the light in this darkness we are experiencing, I want to mention three that come to mind. One is the note that Carolyn Kennedy wrote to Stephen this week, expressing her appreciation for not only his reference to the book of Job, but by his willingness to continue to connect to her as both friend and pastor. I think the second of Stephen's social distance spiritual connections memo that he sent to us earlier this week. I think of the bishop's commitment to communicate with us each Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. These are ways and means by which we're responding in this desert that is both physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual among us. And it begins to answer the question that needs to be asked. And that is, how do we bring compassion and support to our neighbors who are in isolation? How do we extend the invitation to others and to ourselves to do the shadow work of composting over fears, anxieties, and despair? And how do we walk together into what is known and to do so without fear? This is our desert today. Slowly, and I've just mentioned three examples, and all over the diocese, I'm hearing of other examples. We're finding ways to connect with one another, to give encouragement, hope, and support. The desert is opening us to each other with a new depth, almost unknown to many of us before this time. And yet we still continue to struggle together, pray together, laugh together, and affirm one another together. This is the beginning of our movement into the light. This morning's gospel story, as long as it is all about this desert that we are experiencing in the midst of the coronavirus. I believe the structure of the story itself provides a way to continue to move together, to continue to expand that light, to continue to move us away from darkness. And there are 7 scenes in this story that helps break that down about how this light comes to us. And there are these. Here is the story in a nutshell. Jesus walks along and his disciples ask him about the origin of blindness. Jesus makes mud and restores the man's sight. The man washes in the pool as Jesus told him to. The response of people is they doubt his identity. And they take him to the Pharisees for questioning. The Pharisees call the formerly blind man in for questioning a second time. His response is to question their questions. Here is the beginning of light emerging, the courage to be. They insult him, however, and drive him out of the synagogue. Jesus seeks out this man and he worships Jesus. And some of the Pharisees are listening to their conversation and they sound a plaintive note of self-doubt. From Jesus, the blind man experiences the light of God and a spiritual vision. And from these 7 scenes, interestingly enough, the following things are addressed. Again, as I've said, the issue of light and darkness, the issue of belief and unbelief, the issue of new knowledge and insight versus ignorance, the issue of abundant life versus narrowness of vision, which equals limited life choices. The issue of obsession conceived as faithful adherence to tradition. These are the things that I got out of these 7 scenes and some issues that emerged for me out of this story. And then I asked myself, what do I need to learn from this story? We must pay attention to God's activity in our midst. This is where we recognize and see light. Belief codified by new knowledge and abundant life in our midst as opportunities for growth and not stagnation. There is a blindness that has more to do with the incessant, or I would call obsessive searching we do when we're trying to find purpose or direction in our lives. Nothing seems to fit or add up. Emotionally, it feels as if one is groping around in the dark. To follow Christ is to develop clarity about who we are and who we are meant to be. I want to read basically an example of this darkness that I see emerging in our world that's operating side by side with all these signs of hope that I have mentioned this morning. And it's from a piece in the New York Times this morning, for those of you who read it or see it, and it's headlined by saying, Trump is faced with crisis too big for big talk. And I want to read just this particular paragraph because it reminds me so much of points 3, 4, 5 in our story this morning about the Pharisees. And it reads as follows. Mr. Trump's performance on the national stage in recent weeks has put on display the traits that Democrats and some Republicans consider so jarring. The profound need for personal praise, the propensity to blame others, the lack of human empathy, the penchant for rewriting history, the disregard for expertise, the distortion of facts, the impatience with scrutiny or criticism. For years, skeptics expressed concern about how he would handle a genuine crisis, and now they know. When he faced a problem in the past, he has sought to somehow cheat or fix the outcome ahead of time so that he could construct a narrative that showed him to be the winner. And I'll end that there. That sounds very much the way the Pharisees talked to the blind man. You are a sinner. How dare you talk to me? We have Moses. We know all things. You know nothing. You have nothing to teach us, nothing to say to us. 21st century versus first century. The same dynamic, the same blindness of darkness in that world invades us right now in our world. And yet, it is this light that this story that talks about. It is these examples that I have just mentioned that's pushing back and hopefully is pushing back that darkness so that when this crisis is over, and it will come to be over at some point, that our lives will be fundamentally changed. We will learn the value of human intimacy in ways that we've not known before. We will learn, as we're beginning to learn, how to use technology in a way that we've not used it before, not just as a functional piece to get things done, but a way to communicate, a way to express empathy, a way to express concern and hope, and give hope to folks in this desert of social distancing and isolation. A response to people who are feeling lonely and in doubt and in alienation. And hopefully, as we more and more begin to use this technology to do this to each other, we begin to experience this light, when we no longer have to depend on this, I hope we've learned a more profound lesson of how we need to depend on each other, and how the face-to-face contact, the conversation, the intimacy is so important. Because in this crisis, we are learning very carefully. The toys and all the other props we have used have been rendered literally almost irrelevant. The bars are closed, the restaurants are closed, the theaters are closed. We have only each other. And that is the gift of light as far as I'm concerned. Finally, I just want to say, the blind man, like us, was simply a person on the street. By the end of the gospel story, he was thrown out of the synagogue for defending Jesus. So I asked you, as I would ask him, what changed him into a disciple? What has changed you or is changing you into a disciple of Christ? Which role fits you best in this story we've just heard? Bystander, believer, confessor, bold challenger? And as we see in this story, the more and more the man could see, he experienced rejection as he became more and more spirit-filled. And so finally, it raises a question for me then, if that is true. And that is, do suffering people know Jesus in a more intimate way than others? I don't have an answer for that. But I ask you to stay with these questions during our sojourn together in the desert this season. This is a Lent like no other. We are actually on a journey of discovery. We are on a journey to understanding who Jesus is as he proclaims that he is the Messiah. We're on the journey to understanding our own response and what our own response to that announcement is, and how that impacts on our own lives and our lives with others. We are indeed being blessed this season in this desert. This desert is opening us up to new possibilities, to new life. And this desert is preparing us in a new way for the resurrection of Easter Sunday. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.